And for the total shock of demand side, which is similar to actually the supply, even though for the supply we saw the 5.6 is, as I was saying, is only the sectors we saw in the table, but for all the COVID impacts, it amounts 9.5 even for the supply shocks. So with comparison supply sides shocks, we do ensure the consistency on the supply and the demand sides. So the economic impacts, the total shock of real GDP is assessed at, here is at minus a drop of 2% or 0.6% vis-a-vis the baseline. And that comes from hotels and restaurant travel, trade, and other services, mining. And we have a resource balance, actually, with a drop worsening due to a drop of 40% in export of goods and services vis-a-vis 2019. And it offset by a drop in imports of goods and services in value term. And government deficit ratio, excluding grant, increased by over 2.5% of GDP vis-a-vis the baseline due to revenue losses and a lower nominal GDP before responses. So here is a table summarizing the economic impact. So we have a baseline. As I was saying, it was the November projection we had. So the real GDP goes from 8.1% with all the shocks assessed. We have overall GDP drop and a recession of 2.2%. So here, in absence of foreign financing, the financing gap with the shock is 2%. And as the mobilization in the shock scenario has not been done, the 2% financing will be done domestically, which will worsen the private sector saving investment situation. The current account will worsen beyond the resource balance, and that will be due to the 50% we saw of the 50% drop in private non-budgetary transfer and a total steeper for remittances in total of 3.5% of GDP. And it implies a worsen of the saving and investment balance, reflecting the deficit and private sector widening excess of investment over domestic saving. And the next part is assessing actually the policy response. Next slide, sir. So for the policy response, we have fiscal response and impulse as of October 2020, which has revision and taking in consideration new policy to put in place to face the COVID impact. So we have here policy response measures in 2019-2020, which include health measures, education, support to vulnerable households, subsidies to enterprises, and the economic stimulus actually will be the side effect of mitigation. So we can look at it on the slides here, which has a table summarizing the fiscal response. So we have fiscal response, fiscal assessed at average of 2.5% of baseline GDP per year for 3 years. So, and this as a peak, you can look at it at 2021 and that the fiscal impulse actually is taking into consideration revenue, a drop in revenue, current spending, capital spending, net lending. So this fiscal response actually is offset by capital spending, which the capital spending which doesn't the cut in capital spending, if you look at the table, increased by doesn't decrease that much. And we have a total spending, the COVID spending of 2.7% of GDP baseline in 2021, which takes us for the fiscal deficit in baseline of percent of baseline from 1.9% to 3.3% of GDP in 2021. And the fiscal deficit here, excluding grants, it's a sum of the fiscal impulse coming from revenue, as I said, and the spending. Next slide, please. Yeah. So which takes us on the expected impact on GDP. So the expected impact on GDP, we have the fiscal response and monetary expansion, initially estimated GDP growth of +2% in 2020 instead of -2% without fiscal response. But the effects of the Q2 lockdown, which has more severe effect and more and slowly recovery on Q3 and 4. We have a revised projection in October 2020, which actually reflect the COVID policy response taken by the government. Yes, so GDP growth in 2020 projected, we project it gives us a -0.2 vis-a-vis 2019, which is a drop of 7% vis-a-vis the baseline. And the largest part of the drop actually come from services. And even though we have less severe hotels and restaurants, the mining, less severe drop than initially projected, but still considerable, and it's less than 1.5 of GDP. The aggregate demand is kept up as COVID shocked scenario, especially for the government. Private demand seem more realistic. So here we have on the demand side, we have, if we compare to the baseline, we have real growth private consumption for drop by 3% compared to the baseline. And we have actually private investment, negative growth of 5%. And you can look at the government side. The government deficit goes up by 2%, 2.5% to 2.5% and 4% in GDP in 1920 and 2021, a bit less than the baseline in the baseline scenario. And we have the higher deficits vis-a-vis the baseline are now more than fully foreign financed. As I said in the shocks, we didn't have financing mobilized externally, but in this policy response, the higher deficit vis-a-vis the baseline is more than fully financed externally. On the external account, the current account worsened by 2.5% of GDP each year for the 3 years, and it's worsened less than the resource balance, and that is due to the budget grant and debt relief. And we have a drop in capital inflow, including FDI, morely due to the postponement of some FDI and public enterprise loan. On the saving investment balance, the current account, excluding grant, we have higher government deficit, excluding grant, account for most of it, 3.3% of GDP per year. On the outcome and the outlook for 2021-2025, and here we'll go first to see the outcome of 2020 compared to what we have in our scenarios. So looking at the COVID impacts after without policy response and the policy response, and for the policy response we have a recession on 0.2%. Looking at the huge shock and the uncertainty, we can say that we're not far from the outcome we have in 2020. And we have here we're looking at the drop, we're looking at the long term, so and the recovery after 2020. So if you look at the graph, we have the baseline, the blue line, and we have in policy response of October and the latest projection and policy response done in May. We can see that the recovery is not even with faster recovery and GDP, we have still a drop in GDP versus the baseline of 11 and 14%. So we have a drop of 11 years, 11 for the policy response and 14% for the May projection versus the baseline we had in November 2019. The last slide actually on the recovery is the previous. Yep. Is the outlook we have now on this is May projections. So with outcome in 2020 of minus 3.4%, we have GDP growth in 2021 expected to be at 5.1, and will be back at the pre-COVID growth in 2023. So, and from the last slide here, for the fast return to pre-COVID growth based on following assessment of growth factors. So for the first return to pre-COVID, so we have no change in labor force participation and little impact on skills education, private investment, including FDI, to return to pre-COVID levels, and step up in public investment, productivity enhancing adaptation in post-COVID areas. And we have suggestion for future economic crisis response preparedness. We have external financing contingency mechanism, especially for private sector, more systemic social support and economic stimulus, and economic impact analysis and tools. So we have, for the tools, we have to come up with more tools which can be deepened in quantitative policy analysis to assess shocks and policy response, and to develop tools for analyzing employment and income, the effect actually of shocks on income distribution. Thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you very much.
I think the questions will be after all the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. You can again join the panel. Mr. Austin, as we said, we will have the 3 presentations and the comment on them after. So thank you, Didier, for the presentation. So we can have the next presenter. You come forward. And due to the time today, because of the traffic jam, we started a bit late. So we'll try to summarize as well as you. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a bit of an echo. Hello? Yeah, okay. Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you heard, my name is Austin Chulu from UNDP. And fortunately, my colleagues have made some brilliant presentations with a lot of figures, etc. I promise I'm not going to go there in that direction. So just bear with me. I will be telling you a story. Now, Seth, is my presentation on? Okay. I think we've been told earlier about the problems that COVID has given us and how we should devise ways and develop methodologies to try and recover from the COVID-19 crisis, as well as we've been given ideas on how to get back to pre-COVID levels. And my presentation today will just pick up on the previous presentations, both from Andrew and my colleague who just presented right now, and try to figure out ways of addressing certain unsaid issues that I think are important and pertinent in our recovery process. And I must say from the beginning that this recovery program from COVID-19 provides us with an opportunity to do things differently and do things better. So in looking at the progress that Rwanda has made, for instance, since 1994, one would want to see, thank you, one would want to see not only a buttressing of this progress, but also improvement in the targeting, yes, in the targeting and also the scope and dimensions of this recovery have to include those that were previously excluded or marginalized. Next one, please. Now, Rwanda has been remarkable. I mean, by any standards in Africa, Rwanda has been quite remarkable. I mean, you look at this slide, we have, we're the third country in cybersecurity in Africa. We are the second country in the ease of doing business. We have the second most competitive markets in Africa. We are safest place in Africa, and so on. So these are real issues that we have to be proud of and we have to protect. But at the same time, we have to use them to leverage new ideas and new approaches to solving development challenges, especially now that we have this challenge of COVID. Let's get back to the slide. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, there's been a shift over the years towards service-oriented sectors. But this shift has also revealed the fragility of the service sector with regards to external shocks such as COVID-19. And we've been told from our previous presenters that the service sector has been the most seriously hit out of all the sectors, especially when one looks at the contribution to GDP. So when we are coining and crafting responses to GDP or loss and the loss of livelihoods, we'll have to take into cognizance that the shift to the service sector industry has to come with some measures that would actually protect these sectors. Next one, please. Now, let me talk a little bit about Rwanda's vision of the good life. Rwanda has a very powerful vision, Vision 2050, and within that vision, there's certain elements that need to be considered. And this, I want to relate this to how we are going to recover better following this COVID-19 crisis. We talk about quality of life as an issue that needs to be buttressed. We talk about the development of smart cities. We are looking at Kigali, for instance, as being one of the regional hubs in financing, etc. But all that will depend on how smart the city is. We're looking at transformation for prosperity, looking at the productivity increases, etc. We're looking at core shared values, and I think Rwanda's homegrown solutions are one of the main engines in these core shared values. We're looking at international cooperation and leveraging on the African continental free trade area. So those are areas where we need to be heading towards. Now, talking about the African continental free trade area, we know that the possibilities and the opportunities that are presented out there need to be responded to by our local businesses, which means we have to ensure that our businesses are ready to participate and be on the international scene. So to do that, I think Andrew is not here, but Andrew and his colleagues are working on regional integration and trade capacitation. I think the Ministry of Trade and Industry is also working towards leveraging the opportunities that are given with this African continental free trade area. But these are the dreams, and these are the aspirations that the country has. But to achieve this, next slide. We need the economics to achieve the good life. What are the economics that are going to be needed to achieve the good life? The first, of course, is sustained economic growth. Now, I think previous estimate had saying to reach in the middle income status by 2035, the country needs to grow by, on average, 10%. We also need to build on the current capital stock that we have, the ICT stock, the ease of doing business. All those issues I raised earlier are supposed to be the building blocks to get to the 2035 target. We'd need to look at investments in human capital, that is the education, health, etc. All those investments that we are going to be doing to improve the health and livelihoods of Rwandans has to be part and parcel of this equation. Natural capital. this is where my presentation is going to dwell on, because that is the capital that has least been addressed in our estimations of GDP. And I'm glad that now, as we speak, the National Institute of Statistics is actually working on developing national accounts that are going to be taking into account natural capital. And then, of course, the built capital, that's the bedrock of the current growth trajectory, has been on public sector investments in built capital. So there's a lot of investment in that particular area. And then the financing systems are important because they are going to be the drivers of all these other investments that I've talked about. So Rwanda is gearing itself to become the financial hub, not only of the region, but possibly of the whole continent in the future. And of course, with that dream, there's also the politics that are needed to achieve the good life. We have visionary leadership as one aspect of the success of this dream. We need to have inclusive development, including gender equality, including pro-poor growth initiatives, solidarity and unity. Here, that's where probably the issues I'm going to be talking to will be mostly focused. We need strong governance institutions and a strong bureaucracy. And I must say here that Rwanda's bureaucracy is probably ranked one of the highest performing bureaucracies in Africa. And this is something that we have to be proud of, that with these programs in mind, we're looking at a bureaucracy that actually does work. And it's not the same in many other countries. The homegrown solutions are something to be proud of, and they've been instrumental in moving development forward. We have currently just in the process of launching the National Human Development Report for Rwanda, which looks at the interplay between homegrown solutions and how the country has moved to a higher human development ranking. So I think at the beginning of this session, at the beginning of the conference, we were told that Rwanda has moved from a human development index value of 0.2 something to 0.5, which is a huge leap forward. And the homegrown solutions were instrumental in achieving that particular objective. And of course, security is quite important. Let's move to the next one, please. Now, this slide, I talked about previously the dreams, the economics to reach where we want to go. And I talked about, what do you call it? Natural capital, built capital, and human capital as elements that contribute towards this. Now, there are certain new thinking about what the real worth of countries are. And the GDP measure is just one of the many other measures for national wealth. There is the issue of happiness, and some countries have gone to the point of measuring national happiness levels just to ensure that there is this social balance between the product-focused gross domestic product measure as opposed to other measures which are equally important but may not be necessarily appearing in the equation that we use to estimate national well-being. And national well-being being the happiness, living conditions, economic well-being, and of course the production capacities of an economy, which we normally concentrate on. Next one, please. Okay, this slide looks at the current drive towards focusing on gross domestic product as an indicator of economic well-being in an economy. And we know that, of course, there's more to the economy than meets the eye, including the proper measurement and valuation of natural capital, which is extremely important, and I'll explain why. and social capital, which includes community, shared values, vision, etc., which are very much in Rwanda's development program. So we look at the development of human capital schools, etc. We look at built capital, physical investments, and so on and so forth. We should also look at what it is that really matters. As we all know, Rwanda's population doubling time is about 25 to 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. Now, most of the population in Rwanda is out there in the rural areas. They depend on natural capital for their well-being. And yet, if we estimate GDP only on account of the productive capacities of a very small population of the country, of the economy, we are leaving out a very big chunk of livelihood that is not measured with the current gross domestic product measures. So we have to rethink when we say we're going back to the pre-COVID levels of 9.4% growth, etc. We will be thinking through what exactly does that mean? Who is producing that 9.4 growth? Which sectors are there? And are they representative of the entire country? Let's move on, please. Now, in this graph, I promised I was only going to use graphs, but this is just one small graph which illustrates the point. The line graph looks at the growth of capital. This was from the UNEP's, United Nations Environment Program, Inclusive Wealth Report. And it looks at Rwanda's trajectory in terms of the three types of wealth, the natural capital, produced capital, and human capital. You see produced capital is going very high, and that is the GDP that we're talking about, yeah? The social capital or the human capital is also going up, but not as much as the, how do you call it, the produced capital. And the natural capital remains very low, or relatively low compared to the other two. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, 61.7% of the population in the country is working with natural capital as their source of livelihood. And yet, in terms of valuation, it's the lowest out of the three different capitals. We have a problem there. If 61% producing 24.1% of value added, which is the actual GDP, then we are left with what? About 39% that are producing what we normally call GDP right now. And we leave out the 61.7% of the population. And that gives us a message. The message is either we are not valuing or measuring natural capital at its true cost or its true value, or we have actually missed it out completely. If you ask a farmer about, let's say, the farmer holding 0.6 hectares of land, that if you grow trees here, or if you leave this tree uncut, it will give you more value than if you cut it now and look at the future. The response probably will be, no, I need the land now. I need to chop the tree now so that I can plant food. Of course, in the short run, that is the logical move to take. But in the long term, that land will start gradually getting degraded, and we have issues with sustainability, especially considering the fact that currently 70 to 80% of the population is in rural areas depending on that land. Come 20, 30 years from now, we are going to have double the population in rural areas that are going to be depending on a land size that is not growing. So we'll have to figure out how to accommodate the new population that is coming into the country to make sure that there is sustainability and there is, at the same time, ensuring food security and so on. So these are considerations that I want us to look at when we are looking at the recovery process. Next one, please. Next, please. Okay. COVID strikes. And then we have the previous presentations now look at the possible scenarios for growth in post-COVID. But I want to bring to the table, yeah, please move on, yeah. What's been done and what we can do about it. The first one is that there's been assessments. Since the onset of COVID last year, the UN system, development partners, etc., did a lot of assessments on the potential impact of COVID-19 on the economy, on various sectors, on the informal sector, on women, on children, on people with disabilities. There was a lot of assessments that were done. And out of those assessments, I know the government produced the National Economic Recovery and also put aside some funds for funding that recovery effort. Development partners also put in quite a bit of resources on the table to make sure that the recovery process is on track and that those sectors that were hardest hit are actually helped along and the impact cushioned. All right? So there are these programs, and they are already underway. The UN, for instance, has this huge program that is looking at the immediate health impact of COVID-19. They're looking at other socioeconomic interventions that are going to bring our informal sector, our industrial base up to speed to be able to respond to this. But that again is, sorry, yeah, move on. That is the natural reaction to this whole recovery process. But I would like to bring in some new approaches. We have this road, very nicely done road here, which talks about pre-COVID position in Rwanda, which I've mentioned and everybody else has mentioned. We're looking at the economic dimensions of the impact of COVID. We're looking at the strategies for recovery, which are in place already. And now, the solutions for implementation of those programs are supposed to be underway. The question is, are we going to call ourselves successful when we reach pre-COVID levels, given the opportunity that we have now to make those people or those segments of the population who were not included in that 9% growth bear the benefits of recovery. So my argument is we need to start rethinking who is included in this drive and who is excluded from that drive to economic progress. Next one, please. So how do we build back better? This is a term that has been now been globally adopted across the countries, that let's build back better after COVID. How do we build back better? How do we build inclusive societies? How do we build in resilience into those sectors that have been badly hit? The informal sector, for instance, where a huge proportion of Rwandans depend on, has been badly hit. How do we build the resilience of the informal sector to make sure that if there's a future crisis, we are better able to address and face that crisis? Next one, please. So we have some challenges, and this presentation is not about giving solutions. I'm just going to start us to think through some of the challenges that we might want to address. Let's go on, please. Okay, scope of the problem is, although we've done some assessments, I think there's still a lot that we haven't really determined out there. I think my colleague Alice, you mentioned gender initially as an area where we need further and deeper analysis as to how the interrelationships in households has changed as a result of COVID, and how the social capital or the social fabric of society is actually being threatened as a result of COVID. We need to look at agriculture as a great multiplier. Of course, it's the short-term absorber of excess labor. It's the short-term go-to sector in terms of food production, in terms of livelihoods, etc. But its contribution to overall national wealth is, relatively speaking, going down. And we have to be mindful here of the importance of food production versus sustainability, or the dichotomy between food security, production, using the current technologies, and the damage to the environment, the damage to future generations. How are we going to address that? We look at issues of social protection. Who do we include in social protection, and what are the exit strategies? How do we graduate people out of receiving social security and start working on their own and earning a living? We look at decent jobs, etc. We look at the well-being. Currently, we are talking about a country where decent jobs, the target for decent jobs has not yet been achieved. And by decent jobs, I mean a job that can actually meet your basic needs from your monthly income from a main job. That has not been achieved. And we have to work towards moving or creating this middle class that will have the ability to have a livelihood that is coming out of their jobs. Now, these are just options and policy suggestions. I mean, okay, the recovery to pre-COVID economic conditions and the situation. I think I've mentioned it. Of course, we have the National Strategy for Transformation and National Economic Recovery Program. We have targets there that we want to achieve. But there's, like I said, 61% of the population, or maybe even more, is dependent on natural capital. We have to protect that. How do we protect it? We'll have to put in place some mechanisms that are going to be incentives enough for people who are using natural capital for their well-being to be able to use it effectively, and we compensate them adequately for the, how do you call it, for the conservation of that natural capital. If we don't do that, the cost of recovery 20, 30, 40 years from now are going to be probably too much to bear, and then we will lose our target of becoming a middle-income country by 2035. Let's go on, please. On the other hand, the Build Back Better paradigm says, okay, here we are right now. We know that globally there's challenges with the environment, challenges with global warming, challenges with, for instance, Kigali and the smoke from motors, for instance. That is a big environmental challenge. How do we build back better now? The issue of cooking energy using charcoal as opposed to gas or other available greener sources of energy. Those are challenges that we have to address now to be able to meet future targets of greening the economy. Of course, in the interim, the transformation from changing from, say, charcoal to other forms of cooking energy are costly. So we'll